What a marvellous use for this magnificent. Would you all? Why don't you all come a bit closer, and we'll be able to hear Oliver and everything much better. Welcome to everyone. It is, as always happens in the Centre for Policy Studies, a most distinguished gathering of our great friends, and welcome and thank you all very much for being here. I'm going to introduce Oliver Letwin in 2 minutes, but first I do want to make an important announcement, which is that I'm going to introduce you now to the new acting director of the Centre for Policy Studies, Robert Colville. Tim Knox has been the director of the CPS for many years and has worked in the CPS for over 20 years, and he's decided to retire, and the board has, I'm very happy to say, appointed Robert Colville as acting director of the CPS. He was the comment editor of the Daily Telegraph, and he was our brilliant editor and creator of CapX, certainly the world's foremost pioneer in creating a digital global think tank of centre-right thinking, which was Robert's creation. Would you join me in welcoming Robert Colville? I'd like to introduce Oliver, and I'd like to introduce him as Oliver Letwin and also as the author of this book. In terms of Oliver Letwin, there is a most important page in the companion to the proceedings of the House of Lords, a very important document, and in it there is a page which you may be familiar with on the procedure of the maiden speech. And in it says that it is very important that the peer who speaks after the maiden speaker must be able to praise the maiden speech, quotes, with sincerity. It's wonderful. And therefore, I am able to praise Oliver Letwin, the man, because with sincerity, because it would certainly never have happened that the bill that I took through Parliament and became the Access to Medical Treatment Act, this would never have happened in its 3-year process if Oliver Letwin had not been in charge in number 10 and supervising the whole procedure over a long period of time. And having said that, I cannot possibly not mention Isabel Letwin, who was at the time the Chief Legal Officer in the Department of Health and led the team in the Department of Health and is now the Chief Legal Officer in the Department for Defence. So I owe Oliver Letwin a huge personal thank you, which I now, if I may, offer. Let me come to Oliver Letwin, the author, which is why we're all here. The CPS, as you all know, and you've come to many of our book launches, we carry out a lot of book launches for a lot of very great authors over the years. This, I would like to tell you, is a most important book. And the reason for that is something that is very current in CPS thinking. Robert Colville is masterminding on November the 13th the launch of the New Generation programme for the Centre for Policy Studies, which claims to be a programme for 21st century conservatism. And I described this, may I go on for one more minute, Oliver? I described this programme when we had our Thatcher conference on security in the summer. Henry Kissinger opened the CPS security conference, and I had the pleasure of sitting with him at dinner. I described this New Generation project that we will unveil on the 13th of November. I hope you'll all be there. And I said to him, as one knows, as the Queen was only saying to me at tea the other day, I do hate name droppers. I said to Henry, and we were sitting there, if I was to say to you, Henry, that when we launch this New Generation project, there are going to be people in the Conservative Party who are going to say, this is the complete relevance to this book, who are going to say, well, what do we need all this for? This is all just a lot of philosophical claptrap. This is just a airy-fairy, what is it, sort of intellectuals, thinkers. Who needs all that? We don't need that. What we need is to keep our feet on the ground, not our head in the clouds, and that's what the Conservative Party is all about. Now, this book is saying something very different and something very close to the heart of the Centre for Policy Studies and all we're doing, which is not surprising, because Oliver's mother, Shirley, was a very distinguished director of the CPS, and Oliver himself has played an important, hugely important role over the whole history of the CPS, which he describes in this book. And so this book is of the greatest importance to the CPS. I hope it's of the greatest importance to the Conservative Party, and it is for that reason that I can, with double sincerity, introduce Oliver Letwin, a great man, and also Oliver Letwin, a great author. Oliver Letwin.
Thank you, Maurice, for hosting this, and also for that immensely generous introduction. I'm surprised you referred to name dropping, because I assume that it's Henry Kissinger who's going around Washington saying that he had dinner with Morris Thatcher. And in fact, I can recall the first time I ever had, it wasn't actually dinner, it was lunch with Morris Thatcher. Francis Maude was then the Shadow Chancellor. This isn't actually an episode of the book, so I'm adding to it for free. And Francis said that we must have a session, a think session together, the Treasury, then opposition Treasury team, and that this would be aided, this reflection, by going to the place in England where we would have the best meal and the warmest welcome. And that was the introduction that I had to Maurice's house in Sussex. Where I encountered for the very first time in my life a tomato. You'll be surprised that I remember this aspect of it, perhaps, Maurice. You might think it was the sort of scintillating intellect or charm with which we were received by you and your wife. No, it was the fact that the tomato salad had whole basil leaves in it. It really struck me, and I've always remembered since, as an act of supreme culinary generosity. Since when I can testify that Maurice has been generous in many, many ways over a very long period. I'm very grateful. I'm not so happy, I have to say, about the fact that Robert Colville's here on my right, because any MP receives an enormous number of emails, and one of the great things one wants to do is receive fewer emails. And no day passes but I receive a CapEx email. And usually, at least these wretched emails have the advantage that you can delete them with a clean conscience, knowing that nothing interesting will be in them. Whereas I always have the sort of lurking suspicion that there might be something in a CapEx email, and I have to read the damn thing to find out whether there is or not. So I'm really very unimpressed by all of that, and I hope you'll make sure that in your time at the CPS you make it thoroughly boring and don't assail us with any ideas that we haven't taken into account in the fine tradition of think tanks. I certainly don't want to tell you what's in this book, not least because I hope you may purchase it and read it. You may indeed be the only people in England that ever do purchase it. So I think I'm in the position which some malicious commentator attributed to the Prime Minister in her meeting at the European Summit recently of begging. Here I am begging you to buy the book, because otherwise it would be very embarrassing for me with my publishers. I have to say I have written a fairly large number of books, none of which have ever sold any noticeable number, and I occasionally receive very embarrassing things from publishers or agents or whatever for sort of £3.47 for royalties. So it really would be wonderful if 50 people bought this. It would already exceed my highest expectations of sales. What I do want to do is to tell you why I wrote this book very briefly, and that comes really in two parts. One part is closely associated with the health department that Maurice was so concerned with, but in this case it's my health. It was an act of therapy, because I felt I really had to tell the story about how it all happened. And it is, of course, a rip-roaring yarn, and you'll be totally fascinated by how it did all happen. And indeed, many people in this room will have quite conflicting views about how it all happened, and will be able to point out with great chortles and delight the things you think are quite wrong, which will also interest you. But it wasn't just therapy. I had another purpose, and that really is encapsulated in the last chapter, although the whole book is a running argument. And it is a book which is arguing that we found our place in British politics again when Mrs. Thatcher came into office and brought with her ideas that had been developed in not far from here in the IEA, and rather further from here in Chicago and in the LSE, and not at all far from here actually it was a slightly different building at that time, of course, but in the Centre for Policy Studies. But I also argue that during that time, we never focused sufficiently on the question of how the free market that she brought back to life could be and should be used not only to fund first-class public services, but also to look after those at the bottom of the heap and to redistribute in intelligent ways that gave people incentives to rise through society instead of keeping them in dependence. I argue that actually the hero of this book, Keith Joseph, was right in pointing to the need for that, and that the rest of us broadly, including Mrs. Thatcher, were wrong in not paying enough attention to that. And I then tried to chart the rather difficult process by which the Conservative Party over quite a long period tried to work its way through that issue and eventually to get to where I think it needed to get to, which is the argument that the free market is the great engine of prosperity that can alone be used to achieve these great goals for society. And it ends, therefore, with the passionate plea that we should in future be a party which believes in the free market, but also in what Keith called the social market, a free market informed by social justice, and one which is, enables a government that is conscious of wider things, social composition and environmental protection, and the beauty of our surroundings, things that have soul, to carry forward a programme that will actually give us a better and nicer country and not just a richer one, for all the people that live in it. And I also argue that throughout that history, we've always been at our best when we were socially and economically liberal. And this is an argument as much for liberalism as for that brand of conservatism. And therefore, it is the opening shot in what I think is going to be, or from my point of view, the opening shot, in what I think is going to be quite a prolonged battle again for ideas within the Conservative Party. And I think, finally, that one of the most important reasons why this set of ideas is the set that needs to win that battle is that we are now faced for the first time in a long while, and actually since Mrs. Thatcher's time, with a genuine ideological rift in British politics. The great triumph of Mrs. Thatcher, of course, I don't go into this in the book, wasn't anything to do with me, but was to convert the Labour Party to the belief that it had to buy into social market liberalism if it was ever to have power. And for a very long while, one could go around the world, and I did go around the world, telling people in many countries that it didn't really terribly matter who was elected in Britain, because whoever it was would run that kind of country. And that has become recently a falsehood for the first time in a long while. And I think if we're going to persuade the younger metropolitan generation to take seriously the proposition that they should be voting Conservative, we are going to have to persuade them not by reference to things which from their point of view are ancient history, but by reference to fundamental principles and living examples, for example, in Venezuela, why the free market can generate the prosperity, why alternative systems of socialist planning don't generate prosperity, and why the prosperity that is generated by the free market can therefore sustain in the long run better public services and more social justice and a nicer society than socialist planned economies have ever produced. And if we make that argument effectively, I think we will regain the initiative and get back into power in 2022. And I think, I know that this is a view not widely shared, but I think all of that is going to turn out to be much more important for the future of our country than the question of how we leave the European Union and what relationship we have to it afterwards, which is a matter of some importance, but I think actually vastly secondary to the question of how we run our own affairs. I hope with this book to redirect the attention of at least a large part of the Conservative Party to the question of what kind of party we should be after Brexit has occurred, rather than focusing exclusively on the period between now and Brexit and then wondering what the hell we're doing when we left. So that's what this book is about. I hope it may infuriate some of you, delight others, and that therefore you will tell all your friends about it, because if each one of you tells 50 people, I shall have sales beyond my wildest.
Thank you, Oliver. Well, Oliver said he will take a few questions. If you'll allow me, I might begin. If it was right that free markets and everything that the CPS stands for, usually referred to as free markets, capitalism, etc., these terms have lost, as you were just saying, that's what the book about, have lost their power over people's minds. The most dramatic example I can give you is that in President Xi's address to the Congress in China, the Chinese used to refer to themselves, or their system, as state capitalism. You remember this? Or they used to refer to it as capitalism with Chinese characteristics. Incredibly, in that, to give you some idea of how the world has changed in exactly the way you're describing, the loss of confidence in those words. Unbelievably, the Chinese have decided that's not what they now say. They've changed their mantra, their basic system description, to, incredibly, socialism with Chinese characteristics. This is an incredible change. So they must have decided that the word capitalism, which for all these last 20 years they thought was a tremendous asset, that this was capitalism with Chinese characteristics, they've changed to socialism with Chinese characteristics. Would you agree? That is an amazing vindication of the reasons you've written this book and the problems that we in the Conservative Party have to deal with that enormous shift, apparently, in the way people are thinking about free markets and capitalism.
Well, I think, Maurice, that actually the vital point is that the people that we are trying to make this argument to, who are not the people who voted Labour all the way through and always will, but are, above all, a group of people who are between the ages of 25 or even younger and 40 or 45, and who are broadly liberally inclined and have soft hearts but quite hard heads. Those people, who are the people that deserted us in some of the cities, and on whose adherence we depend if we're to get re-elected. I think that all of those people are actually still attached to the fundamental principle which actuated Mrs. Thatcher's quasi-revolution, which is the principle of liberty. And actually, I don't think we should be talking in terms, in the end, of capitalism and socialism, but in terms of liberty and what can happen if people's energy is liberated, and how a society can channel the effects of that liberation into achieving certain social goals. And I think if we can put things in those terms, we will actually find that it is as attractive to those people as we always hoped it would be, because they have in fact grown up with that in their minds. They just don't recognise that that's what they've been thinking all this while, and we don't want them to come to realise it with a terrible thump when Mr. Corbyn has been running Britain for a while and they suddenly realise it wasn't what they'd hoped they were voting for. We have to bring to their attention before that happens that actually liberty is the essence of this matter, and I think we can achieve that, and by adopting that language.
And that's exactly what we're going to try and do. Now, who would like to ask some questions? I can see quite a few hands. Let's come to you first.
Brian Rigby, a much more important person than I said the medium is the message. Do you not think that no matter how good the message you've just described may be to those of us who are converted, that the means of getting it to the generation that you're talking about is, in the time scale that we are all worried about at the moment, the most important issue?
No, I don't think that, or rather I don't agree with part of that. There will come a time, and to be precise, I think it's the time around 2021, early 2022, when selling the message in the person of a leader who's attractive to those people and to other people in the country, and in a way that's attractive to them, and with a few specific policies that are attractive to them, and are hence more or less the polar opposite of the 2017 manifesto, which was precision bombing the voters that I was speaking to on the doorstep, will be vital. Politics is, in the end, of course, about election campaigns and winning election campaigns. Sordid and dull as it may be, it is actually necessary. And you have to do it well rather than badly. And that does require the medium as much as the message. But actually between now and the middle of 2021 or so, I think we have time on our hands, which we mustn't misuse. And that actually means recapturing the intellectual initiative and not getting mired in administrative detail, but going back to these fundamental principles and trying to show how they apply to the great issues of our age in a modern idiom and a way that feels relevant, so that whoever is the leader as we go into that election, long after Theresa has taken us through Brexit, actually has something much better and bigger than just a set of policies dreamed up at the last moment for a manifesto. In the end, principles and ideas have to precede practical policies and the selling of a message. And that's the period we're now in, and we must use it. And of course, I didn't design things so that I wouldn't be in government now. I found myself rudely ejected from government, as I describe in the book. But actually, had I thought about these things more clearly, I would have ejected myself, because actually, those poor people, my former colleagues, many of them great friends of mine, now find themselves imprisoned in the ghastly operation of trying to manage this country through Brexit, keep its finances in order, carry through all sorts of administrative actions which are very necessary but totally dull, and fend off thousands of marauders and put out hundreds of forest fires, and therefore haven't a remotest amount of time to think about these basic principles. That falls to the rest of us who are outside that machine and can actually do this thinking now, and that is our solemn duty.
Sorry, can I just interject? Could people sort of move towards this way in the room so that we
Yes,
can
so let
allow some of
everyone
the
Good idea.
some of the more recent arrivals to hear what's being said.
Come on through.
Hopefully the acoustics are doing it.
And as you're, do come in everyone please, there's a question, there's some more here. In the corner there, yes, please go ahead. If you'd say, it would help the author if you said who you are and introduced yourself.
My name is
Do
Dr.
come in.
Anshul Gupta, and I work in finance, I'm not in politics. The book is called Hearts and Minds, and my question to you is of two parts. Which do you feel is more powerful when it comes to persuading the floating voter, the heart or the mind? And how, the second part, as a party, can we be more persuasive?
Well, I think my answer to your first question is that I don't think it's either heart or mind. I think it's about heart and mind, and that's why I have called the book Hearts and Minds. It seems to me that the point about the Conservative brand, and certainly the liberal free market brand that I'm advocating here, is that it can appeal to the mind because its propositions happen in world history to have been proved true. I think that's quite a powerful argument, and I think we can illustrate in an intellectually convincing way why, if a country wants to be prosperous over the long haul, it had better arrange its affairs in the sort of way that most of us in this room, I think it should be arranged. But I think if we stick at that, we will never be attractive. Hang the people that we haven't attracted. I don't think we'll even be attracted to people that are already voting for us. Because actually people do also have hearts, they have souls. They care about whether grandma gets her hip replaced, they care about whether there are beggars in the streets, they care about whether the place looks beautiful or ugly, they care about all sorts of things that aren't just about the engines of prosperity. And my argument is you have to unite these two thoughts in order to have something which is not only something which is attractive, but actually something which is worth selling. In the end, politics isn't about trying to sell a bad second-hand car to a reluctant purchaser. It's about designing a Rolls-Royce and then persuading people that it is a Rolls-Royce and it's worth paying for it. Or in this case, voting for it. So far as the question of how we sell the message, therefore, is concerned, I think there are two things I can say. The first is, you have, first of all, to have the Rolls-Royce before you can try selling it. And I'm in the business of trying to help us construct the Rolls-Royce. And secondly, once you've done that, if you had to choose a person in Britain that I would recommend you not to ask about how to sell these things, I would be it. Which is why I'm not offering the slightest clue about this. Morris is a long-term guru and genius at selling things and at inventing slogans, and I am acutely conscious that any time I've ever tried to sell anything to the British public, it hasn't worked. So I'm not going to try that again. I'm just going to try to make sure that there's something worth selling.
I saw you here.
Before the election, everybody was saying that Conservatives would come back with a big majority, and people were saying of young people they're essentially Conservatives, that they're shunning drugs and alcohol and all that sort of stuff. And then as the election campaign proceeded, there was a dramatic change in everybody's opinion about what was going on. And I was interested in what you were just saying, that people, young people and people up to the age of about 40, their commitment to liberalism is still there. But what is your take on what actually happened in the campaign? Why did things change so dramatically in such a short time?
Well, I think three things essentially happened, two of which are actually pretty irrelevant to the future, and one of which is very relevant to the future. The first thing that happened, what I mentioned, is that we really did exceed all expectations. Nobody has ever designed, in my political experience, and as I've written a certain number of manifestos, I have actually read back through. I know I saw David Willetts at the back. I think he's probably the only person who's read more manifestos than I have. But I have read a lot.
Even less successful than yours.
Between us, David and I have both read and written a lot of manifestos. Put it that way. And I have never seen a manifesto produced by anybody that was as calculated to deter voters more likely to vote for the party as this one was. And I went to street after street where people who had said the week before they were going to vote for me weren't even willing to open the door once they read, or read reports anyway, of the manifesto. I don't delude myself, they'd read the manifesto, they didn't need to. In fact, my main aim was to keep the manifesto as far as away from the people of West Dorset. But that's irrelevant for the future, because I really do not believe that the Conservative Party could muster the skill to produce a manifesto. That does this again. The second reason that things went wrong as the election proceeded was different, but again irrelevant to the future, which is actually we went into the election with Theresa, who, as a matter of fact, although I've argued with her about many things over a long period, and don't wholly agree with her about the direction of the party, is actually a superb administrator, a brilliant negotiator, very straightforward, very honourable, and had huge qualities, therefore, for someone who was going to guide us through the Brexit process. Had actually, I think, established herself before the election in the public mind as having those qualities. I think what really went wrong on that front was that, because she didn't lose those qualities, but what happened was, when this manifesto hit the public, and with a resounding thud, and all her advisors told her that it was a disaster, what she should have done, in my view, is to stick with it like glue, to show that at least she stuck with things like glue, which is what we all were voting for someone taking us through Brexit, whereas in fact she started a sort of semi-retreat, and that destroyed the credibility of a campaign which was entirely built, that was mistake number two, of course, on Theresa's capacities as a brilliant administrator and a tough negotiator and an unyielding person. So we not only target bombed the voters, we also destroyed the brand. Those are bad things to do in the middle of an election campaign. Although I'm not an expert on election campaign, but even I know that's a bad way to run. But those are irrelevant in the sense I don't think we're going to face those situations again. The bit which was not at all irrelevant, and which actually some of us were pretty aware of, I put a pretty large bet on Mr. Corbyn winning in 2020. At a time when I got, I think it was 113 to 1. Nobody in Britain thought Mr. Corbyn would win in 2020 when we were about 6 months away from the election. The reason I thought he'd win in 2020 was partly that I think it would be quite a difficult moment, 2020, in our national history, and partly because I think that Mr. Corbyn, I've always thought Mr. Corbyn is a brilliant campaigner. I've seen him campaigning a bit over the years. I thought he did brilliantly in campaigning in the Labour Party itself. I think he's an extremely attractive figure. He's just an attractive man. And I think he's particularly attractive for our age, our times, so to speak, because he has the unvarnished character, which is now very fashionable. Now, Mr. Trump also has this character, but he doesn't have quite the charm that even he's done jolly well, after all. Jeremy combines charm with absolute... Morris says that in the House of Lords you are required to be sincere, but Jeremy is genuine. He is sincere. He really thinks these things. It's a terrifying thought that he really believes what he's saying. And he's always thought it, and he's always said it, and he'll go on saying it to his dying breath, and this is a very attractive commodity. And also, he's a genial personality. He's really quite likeable. Now, if you're likeable and sincere, you come across to voters as likeable and sincere. This is quite a powerful thing. And if nobody is remotely attending to what you are actually saying, because they think you haven't a chance in hell of winning, and you go into an election attractive and sincere, with no interrogation of your programme, you're quite likely to win. So I put the bet on. Now, the great luck was we managed to accelerate this process and bring out the attractiveness of Jeremy Corbyn at a time when it was relatively harmless, and we just lost our majority. We didn't actually lose an election. And actually, I'm now rather optimistic about 2022, because I think by then we can cure the problem in the sense we can get our act together on our own prospectus. We can have a campaigner on our side in 2022 taking us into that election, and we can be in a position where we can disassemble the Corbyn agenda, not by parody and partisan attack, but by careful demonstration of what it would actually lead to under the circumstances. I think we put all those things together, actually, there's every reason to suppose we can get back into power in 2022, and if we have the right programme, govern the country well.
Shall we do, well, I'm coming to you, yes, and then I'll take that last question.
Right,
Okay,
yeah.
go ahead.
No, it's actually, thank you for mentioning our party congress. Actually, the system we are describing now is called New Era Socialism with China characteristics.
Thank you very much.
And the presidency. My question to Sir Oliver is that how Theresa May, the Prime Minister, is different from Margaret Thatcher? Not bad, you have produced two female Prime Ministers. I mean, in terms of political belief, in terms of their approach to the role of government, to the role of markets, is Theresa May more socialist than Margaret Thatcher, who is very conservative?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Incidentally, I did spot the New Era of Socialism, which I thought was quite a brilliant coinage for presidency. That's a very interesting question. What is the difference between Margaret Thatcher and Theresa? We have in the room the great biographer of Margaret Thatcher, and many people here who, one way or another, knew her or worked for her or both, or were colleagues of hers, and each will have their own opinion. My sense is that there are two fundamental differences between the two of them in approach. One is that although there were certainly things that Mrs. Thatcher was determined to regulate, her basic instinct, so far as possible, was not to regulate the activities of citizens and businesses if you could avoid it. I think she thought that in the end people prospered more, society as a whole prospered more, when people could get on with their own lives and fashion, as Michael Gove once put it, their own life story with the least possible interference from the state. Whereas I think Theresa is much more inclined to believe that it is possible for the state to work out how to channel people's activities and enterprises in ways that will be socially beneficial by suitable regulation. And she and I had very long-running arguments about regulation when we were colleagues in government over many years, and indeed in opposition, and I found the Home Office almost impossible to breach when I was commissioned by David Cameron to go around trying to get departments to deregulate. Theresa is, as I mentioned, a brilliant administrator, and she laid down the law in the Home Office, and I could really never get any sensible deregulation at all in the Home Office. It took me a very, very, very long while to get them to deregulate the ability for people owning bed and breakfast joints to provide a small bottle of champagne for people when they came to occupy a room in the bed and breakfast, which at the moment you require, or didn't require until we changed it, a full license, as if you were a pub, to do it. And it took me 2.5 years to get the Home Office to change that regulation. You will observe her belief in the merits of regulation. That's one difference. The second difference is that and incidentally, amongst many similarities as well. But the second difference, I think, is that in the end, you are either a politician with an international perspective, or you're a politician with a British perspective. And oddly, I think that Mrs. Thatcher was ultimately a politician with an international perspective. It's perfectly true that she was enormously concerned to change things in this country. But I think she saw that as part of a global change. And Charles, in his magisterial biography, brings out very much the amount of attention, it certainly felt like that working for her, that she devoted to trying to work with President Reagan, for example, and trying to refashion the whole relationship between the Soviet Union as it then was and the West and so on. Whereas I think Theresa is much more focused on the domestic agenda than that. It's a strange irony that Theresa's premiership is dominated by an international issue, a crypto-international issue of Brexit. But that was forced on her, not something that she chose. And I salute her for undertaking it, but it isn't it isn't a sign of internationalism, it's a sign of necessity.
Let's take a last question.
I'd like to bring us back to the title of your book, please, Oliver, Hearts and Minds. There's another profession where we use this term regularly, and it is education, and I'm actually in education. We use that phrase, hearts and minds, incessantly. Whilst I agree with your definition of youth being able to be sold through liberalism, the issue that I find in education is the people who are influencing them through hearts and minds are their teachers and their tutors. And I believe that only 7% of educationalists voted Conservative last time. Do you have any advice for me on how I can change this from the educationalists' level?
Actually, my advice, and I've given wrong advice to so many people so long a period that perhaps I'm quite wrong about this too, but my advice would be not to worry. I once had a very serious conversation with the former chief rabbi about an issue relating to Jewish schools, and he looked at me very soulfully, and he said, I was educated at St. Mary's and Christ's College, and they don't seem to have done a very good job. And I thought that was pretty strong indication of the truth in belief which I share with him, that actually, although teachers may try to influence the politics or religion of their pupils, in general, they manage to produce very mixed results, which is a polite way of saying a massive reaction. This is of great comfort to all those of us who agree with you that a large number of teachers at the moment are of a certain disposition which we don't find attractive. I think, therefore, the best thing to do is to get on with teaching and make sure that the pupils are well endowed with a good education, and this will enable them to make up their own minds about these matters, and it's on them.
Thank you all. I'm now going to exercise, as it's 5 to 8, and I want to let our guests go, I'm now going to exercise the time-honoured prerogative of the chairman of the Centre for Policy Studies to ask the final question. So, if I was to put it to you, Oliver, that you will recall that the Prime Minister, this Prime Minister, on the steps of Number 10 when she became Prime Minister, gave a speech which is very important to see what she was hoping to achieve. And what she said in that speech, which is now framed in Number 10 in many people's offices, and it is a wonderful speech in which she says that her aim is going to be to combat inequality, injustice and unfairness. Now, those terms never appeared again. They certainly disappeared from the following general election campaign. They were never mentioned. If I was to put it to you, Oliver, that she was advised that those words, inequality, injustice, unfairness, should never pass her lips again, because they are Labour words, and therefore it is a mistake for a Conservative Prime Minister to use those 3 words. Now let's just say that that is actually what happened. What would you say to that advice if that's what she was told?
Well, I was taught at an early stage by a very sage teacher never to accept the implication of a question. And I don't have any reason to suppose that your account of the event is remotely right. However, as we have this delightful Morissace sandwich, and I'm now in a position to answer the substantive question, my answer is that those words are very good words for Conservatives to use, not as things we wish to promote, but as things we wish to remove. Inequality and injustice we want to get rid of, and fairness we want to advance. And that's because actually any decent human being wants to do those things. So they can't be Labour words or Conservative words. They are words which belong to the soul of a magnanimous individual. And we have as much claim on that as anybody else. And the language is incredibly important. To allow any piece of language to be colonised by the opposition is a grave error. My goodness, I've just spotted Francis Maud there, so of course the origin of this story was right there. He'll undoubtedly tell me I got it wrong. I'm reminded that the Puritans were the experts in this. When the Puritans began their work, Quentin Skinner is quite brilliant about this, the word thrift was a word of gross abuse. It meant mean, being mean. To be thrifty was to be mean. And the Puritans wanted to change people's views of what it was to be careful with your money. And they started using thrift as a pro word, and they turned it into what you would describe as a Puritan word. Actually, ever since then, it's been a virtue to be thrifty. In fact, in Scotland, I'm told it's the virtue. As in Ogden Nash's famous remark that no McTavish was ever lavish. And a good thing too, because thrift is a fine thing. But so is eradicating injustice, and so is promoting fairness, and so is getting rid of gross inequality. These are things that any government should be proud to do, and we should never allow ourselves to be brought into the thesis that there's any part of the political terrain or any part of the political rhetoric which belongs to some other party. You can't take out ownership of ideas.
How wonderful. Oliver, would you all agree with me that we've heard very inspiring words, particularly in the last 2 minutes. On top of the previous 20. This book contains all this wisdom, and you've just heard a flavour of it. So do now thank Oliver Letwin, and please come and buy the 50 copies he wants to sell tonight. Thank you for coming.